We're going to do a prophecy update this week. Next week, I hope to get back to the 7 letters to the 7 churches in Revelation. But since I was gone for about a month, there's been some things that have kind of stacked up on my hard drive. So this is a clean off John's hard drive week, and we'll move on next week. We continually talk in here that as we get closer to the end, there is this convergence of signs where all of these things will be happening. All of these things will be in play at the same time. And as we get closer to the end, that they will accelerate and happen more quickly. Remember, the prophecy is pattern principle. When Jesus came the first time, most of the prophecies concerning his first coming, about 60% of them, were fulfilled in the last week of his life. It will be like at the time, it will be the same pattern at his second coming. We'll see some things start to be fulfilled, they'll be fulfilled, and then near the end, as we approach the second return of Christ, at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, there'll be a rapid acceleration of fulfillment of Bible prophecy, just like it was the first time. And so we will notice these things happening more and more. One of the things we look at here is economics. The Bible prophesies that near the end of time there will be severe economic hardship. This is an interesting article in The Economist a couple of weeks ago, and what it says essentially is this, is we're getting older. Populations are aging. There are more old people around, and that has economic consequences because old people, by and large, don't spend as much money and they save more, so therefore there's not as much consumer-driven demand for people, and if there's not consumer-driven demand, then people have trouble having jobs and that type of thing. Here's an interesting chart that shows old age dependency, age 65 and over, per 100 people. Okay, so for every 100 people aged 25 to 64, those would be people in their working productive years, how many old people are there? So let's just use Japan as an example. Back here in 2000, Japan had about 30 people 65 or older for every 100. So about 30% of the population above age 25 was 65 or older. By 2010, that had risen to 42. That's a pretty big leap in just 10 years. And then by 2035, it's projected that they'll have about 70, I think it's about 70% of the people in that age. So for every 100 people that are still working, there'll be 70 old people. That doesn't work economically. That has a huge impact. And when you look at the reproduction rate or the fertility rate in Japan and other Western countries, they are collapsing. They're collapsing in virtually all countries around the world. There are a few exceptions, particularly in the Muslim world, although that is somewhat going down because of the wars and conflict. So here in the United States, right now we have about 25 people over 65 for every 100 between 25 and 64, and we're projected to be at 42 by 2035. At that number, it doesn't work very well. And then when you look at China and other places, even China, when they get up close to 40 people, when you consider that China has, say, 1 billion people between 25 and 64, and you add to it that for every 100 of those, that means 400 million old people. That has huge impact on society, culture, and that type of thing. The other thing that they're showing, though, too, is that the more education you have, the longer you're likely to continue to work. So I don't know if that's good or bad, depending on your age, but if you have a professional degree or a doctorate, you're going to be working. Men are going to work almost until they're 70 as a general rule. I'll talk about this in a moment. but this is having an impact. There's a severe drought in California. We just spent about 3 weeks out there, and in that period of time, they had it rained one night when Pam was there before I got there. There's a little bit of rain another day, but they are bone dry. You're having day after day of 90-degree temperature and 3% relative humidity. You get up in the morning, there's not even dew on the ground. The farms up in the Central Valley are really struggling. There's very little. The snowpack was 4% of normal as of May 20th, which means that at the end of the snow season, the snowpack was 4% of what it should be in a normal season. Most of the water to fill reservoirs in in California comes from snow melt runoff in the Sierras. That's a frightening number, especially when you consider that some reservoirs were already at about 18 to 20% of capacity. They were getting very dry and low. Now, to prove that, government isn't the answer, this editorial in the Wall Street Journal yesterday talked about the fact that to help salmon get upstream, they released massive amounts of water, thousands of what they call acre feet of water from the reservoirs around California to protect little fish that are on the endangered species list and salmon, which had already been able to swim upstream because there was plenty of water. It just wasn't flowing as fast as some bureaucrat in Washington wanted it to be. This is what tax dollars support. I say this as an example of what we talk about, that there's deception in the world, and this deception is described various places in the prophetic scriptures, that deception in the end times operates on a geopolitical level, it operates on a economic level, it operates on a religious level, and it increases as we get closer. And this is an irrational act. This makes no sense to most people with common sense. At the same time, the scientists are warning that there'll be rising oceans. Again, the two independent studies from the UN say that they're going to be rising ocean levels. Goodbye, Florida. Now, my reaction to this is, I've not been to the Netherlands, but my understanding is they've been under sea level there for centuries, and they're still a thriving society. So I think that people and human ingenuity can deal with it. And you people in Florida, they don't build basements there anyway. So this is what people say. A lot of in fact, our Secretary of State felt compelled to bring this up in his commencement address at his alma mater.
Local doctors and nurses are making possible the dream of an AIDS-free generation. We're on the cusp of achieving that. And what we have done to turn back the armies of defeatism and indifference in the fight against AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and even polio, this work should give every one of you confidence to confront another cross-border, cross-generational challenge, the challenge of a changing climate. If we're going to live up to our values, this is a test that we have to meet. And I know it's hard to feel the urgency as we sit here on an absolutely beautiful morning in Boston. You might not see climate change as an immediate threat to your job, your community, or your families. But let me tell you, it is. Two major recent reports, one from the UN and one from retired U.S. military leaders, warn us not just of the crippling consequences to come, but that some of them are already here. 97% of the world's scientists tell us this is urgent. Why? Because if crops can't grow, there'll be food insecurity. if there's less water because of longer droughts, if there are stronger and more powerful storms, things will change in a hurry, and they will change for the worse. Climate change is directly related to the potential of greater conflict and greater instability. I'm telling you that there are people in parts of the world, in Africa today, they fight each other over water. They kill each other over it. And if glaciers are melting and there's less water available and more people, that is a challenge we have to face. And guess what? It is the poorest and the weakest who face the greatest risk.
Again, there's this appeal to authority. 97% agree with me. I don't think the number is that high. Perhaps it is. But the one thing you should notice is that he believes in the apocalypse. He just believes it'll be man-made instead of God bringing about fulfillment of his plan. Here's the concluding part of his speech.
This is not a matter of politics or partisanship. It's a matter of science and stewardship. And it's not a matter of capacity. It's a matter of willpower. But if we do nothing, and it turns out that the critics and the naysayers and the members of the Flat Earth Society, if it turns out that they're wrong, then we are risking nothing less than the future of the entire planet. This is not a hard choice, frankly, but still, let me tell you, we need the help of every single one of you to make it.
So that's it. If you disagree with me, you're a member of the Flat Earth Society. This is typical of politicians on the left in demeaning people that disagree with them. And if you listen to his full speech, it's there's all these wonderful things that will happen. And even if I'm wrong, everybody will have jobs making all this stuff that we didn't need. But when people are wrong on Israel, they'll be wrong on other things. You can almost guarantee that. Well, we haven't done a Middle East update for a while, so let's just take a look at this. Syria continues to be in a state of change. I was just thinking of this, Mike and Jerry. It was 3 years ago. We were on the bus coming down through the Jordan Valley, and there were news reports that day as we were coming down to Beit Shan. They're in sort of the southern part of northern Israel, and about 25, 30 miles away is a city called Dara. And in that city, on that day, they had protests against the Assad regime. That was the beginning of the Syrian civil war. We sit here now 3 years later, over 150,000 people are dead. There are about 2.8 million people in refugee camps. That number is probably understated by 500,000. There are 750,000, 750,000 in Turkey, 600,000 in Jordan, and 1 million in Lebanon, over 1 million in Lebanon. And then other places make up this number. There are at least 9 million out of a population of about 21 million when the war started. 9 million people are either in refugee camps or displaced internally in Syria. About 40% of the population. That's a stunning number. I mean, imagine 40% of Americans not living where they lived 3 years ago. It has a huge impact. This is a picture of a refugee camp in Turkey that's relatively new. And there are camps in Jordan that have hundreds of thousands of people. They're the second or third largest city in the nation of Jordan now. They're having huge impact. People don't like these people. They're treating them badly. There's bad sanitation. It's a humanitarian and logistical nightmare and a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions. As the war has progressed, there have been some significant developments in the last week. The rebels surrendered Homs back to the Assad regime. Damascus continues to be under attack, although Assad is there. It appears that Assad has pretty much consolidated his control over most of the country. Some people say that the West, United States, and other countries are not too unhappy with that because he's a bad guy, but at least he's only one bad guy, and we don't know what these rebels will do. But the rebels have also established jihadist training camps throughout Syria, including 4 in the Damascus area, that their goal is not Syria, their goal is global jihad. Aleppo continues, that's the largest city in Syria. It continues to be under attack, and there is expected to be a push by Syria to take over Aleppo, the Syrian government under Assad to take over Aleppo in the near future. Daraa, my understanding is that even as we speak, there are troops in this region. There's a little town called Nawa that's just a little bit north of Daraa, not too far from the Golan Heights, and you can find it on LiveLeak. There's a video of a massive shelling, just literally dozens, at least dozens, if not hundreds of shells hitting all over this town of Nawa in about a 30-second period from the Syrian government troops. Some headlines just from the past few days. The Pentagon has assigned 13,000 United States servicemen to their first ever U.S., Jordanian, and Israeli joint drill. That will be done shortly. The Assad regime has turned guns and Hezbollah on rebels in southern Syria, down here in the area of the Golan Heights. There's a town called Quneitra? Huh? Quneitra. If you've ever been to the Golan Heights, you can see the town there across the no man's land. Hezbollah and Syrian forces are moving into that area. That brings into play Israel. Israel is very concerned about what's going on. Again, I mentioned that there's this battle for Aleppo. That could be the final thing in the civil war. Most of the people in Syria live along this area. There's also the rest of the population pretty much lives along the Euphrates River, and those areas are effectively under Assad's control. Israel made this announcement, the Israeli Defense Force, that if Syria crosses the Golan Heights border, Assad will fall. This is a quote from the newspaper this morning in Israel. Military officials said the concerns are rising over a possible attack from Syrian President Bashar Assad, whose efforts are heavily backed by Russia and Iran. They reassured the public, however, that the Israeli Air Force is ready to deal with threats from the north and to attack targets with near-surgical precision. If it happens quite a lot, almost daily, that a Syrian plane fighting with rebel forces approaches the Golan Heights border. When it does happen, Assad will fall. It's bound to happen. In other words, Israel is not going to take it. They're not going to have the risk of Syria attacking them. They're making preparations to deal with the problem that's coming from Assad in Damascus. That should have some echoes to you of a prophecy in Isaiah chapter 17, which talks about the fall of Damascus, the city that by most estimates is the longest continuously occupied city on the planet. And I would add, so far. These are some pictures of the destruction. If you look at get on the internet and go and just look at Syrian destruction pictures, it is astonishing what the Assad government has done to its own people. There is city after city, town after town, neighborhood after neighborhood that looks like this. And it's hard after a while, you can't remember if they're Homs or Aleppo. I believe this is people walking down the street in Homs that the Syrian government took back from the rebels this week. That scene of destruction is repeated hundreds, thousands of times all over the cities of Syria. So now you can understand why 9 million out of a population of 21 million are displaced. I can show you pictures of skyscrapers that are pancaked, half of them pancaked, because of the the destructive things that the Syrian government has done. But Iran and Assad are now saying that they won in Syria.
So what is their purpose of doing this? I mean, typically rulers want people to work and generate taxes so they can live more wealthy lifestyles, but this is crushing everything. What are they going to have left?
This is really about raw power, having power and control. I mean, listen, Assad will sit in the question was, why are they doing this? I heard somebody say just recently, civil wars are, in fact, I think it was Jacob Pratchett's teaching from last night on Rapture Ready Radio. The worst wars in terms of destruction, displacement, and bad consequences are civil wars. Wars with other countries, you won't go and destroy things completely. And Jacob, by the way, compared it to there's a war between true religion, Christianity, and false religion. But there is now a civil war, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, going on inside the church. We talked a little bit about that last week with mysticism, the rise of mysticism, and how it's overtaking evangelical churches. There are other areas. I'll talk about one other example of that at the end of this morning. And the civil wars in the church are going to be worse than the wars with the other false religions. Oh, it's easy to attack Mormons and cults and Hindus and Buddhists, on a intellectual, religious, faith basis. But when it's what you perceive to be your brother, it can get really ugly very quickly. But the question is, the only answer that I can give you to is why does Assad do this? Is it's raw power. Do you think Assad gives do you think he's lost 1 minute of sleep at all? Because he's living in a palace or a well-provisioned bunker somewhere, and this is about maintaining his family's dynastic dictatorial power over Syria. That's all he's concerned about. He could care less about the millions of people that are displaced. The millions of people that will never come back. Syria will, assuming the Lord comes soon, Syria will never be the same. I think it'd be fair to say that Assad will be the same. He'll be just as evil then as he was now. For a long time, people thought he's trained as an ophthalmologist, went to school in London, met a gal there, got married, came back. And a lot of people felt he was weak because he had an older brother who was killed in a car accident who was supposed to have been the heir to the power there in Syria. He took over. A lot of people thought, he's just this, kind of big, dumb, lanky guy that isn't that bad. But now he's shown that he's at least as bad as his father ever was. And fear is power in that part of the world, in much of the world. These are pictures of, in Nigeria, attacks by a group called Boko Haram. And the word essentially means, Boko Haram essentially means that we have to attack people that are without Sharia, that don't live under Sharia law. You've heard about the 300 and some young ladies that have been kidnapped, hundreds of people slaughtered, burned to death, churches set on fire while people are inside them. And very often you will see articles in mainstream media. For example, here's one from the New York Times not so long ago. So they run this article telling all this stuff that's done. Destruction like this, attacks, young girls kidnapped, sold into slavery, made wives, made to convert forcibly to Islam. And then they say this: Boko Haram's exact goals, beyond a generalized desire to undermine the secular Nigerian state, remain mysterious. Now, I have no idea how such an idiotic statement gets past the editors at the New York Times. I suspect I know why, but it does. And so here's another report of dozens killed in a blast in the Nigerian capital. A lot of this attack that's going on in Nigeria and elsewhere are attacks against Christians. And Christians are under attack. Someone this morning who was quoted as the Pope went to Jordan and then over to Bethlehem said, we are a declining minority throughout the Middle East, except in Israel, I might add. I'm not sure how that works. Another significant thing that you should watch is the things going on with Russia. Putin seems to be consolidating his power. He's pulled back a little bit. But Putin has this view that he is, this is him walking through the Kremlin, he is a czar. Russia's an interesting country. I do think it has some relevance in Bible prophecy. It is an enormous country. Saw a report this morning that all the longitudinal zones of the world, Russia covers almost half of them. Think of it in terms of time zones. I think Russia covers, if there are 24 time zones, Russia has at least 11 time zones that it covers. It's a massive country. Doesn't have any really good mountain ranges or anything to protect it from its enemies, but it has fewer people than the nation of Bangladesh that live in a little tiny place down on the Indian Ocean. Putin wants to, and I talked about this, you might go back and look for the teaching a month or so ago, that there's a very heavy religious component to what Vladimir Putin is doing. There's almost a messianic quality. His use of a religious icon called the Lady of Kazan, and he wants to protect the ethnic Russians in the borderlands around Russia. He wants these countries, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, as buffer zones from what has been historically a lot of invasions coming from Europe. Even the Swedes and the Finns have invaded Russia in the past. So there's this thing in the Russian psyche that they need to protect their own ethnic group. There are huge implications, too, to the war in Crimea and the peninsula there in the Black Sea, and how that relates into control of sea power and sea lanes in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. One of the things that happened, this is an older article from about a month ago, was that although this turned out to be not exactly official government policy, Jews were being told that they had to register in eastern Ukraine. That's in the Russian ethnic area. And remember, the Russian Orthodox Church is extremely anti-Semitic in its orientation. And Putin is very strongly oriented towards the Russian Orthodox Church because it's sort of a melding of church and state. So the Jews, you see this rising anti-Semitism all over the place. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Israel right now has Pope Francis in Israel this morning. Today, he was in Jordan yesterday. He went to Bethlehem this morning, and on his way from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, he stopped at the wall and said a prayer at the security wall there. One of the things that the Bible predicts, prophesies, is that in the end times we'll see this rising anti-Semitism. It'll come from all quarters. There was a report a month ago, a lot of articles about what Barack Obama had said in an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg of Bloomberg. He said this: "What we also know is that Israel has become more isolated internationally. We had to stand up in the Security Council in ways that 20 years ago would have involved far more European support, far more support from other parts of the world when it comes to Israel's position." So mark this down, 1132. I actually agree with him that Europe, the support of Israel in Europe is declining. Anti-Semitism is rising. But Obama has this way of taking facts and twisting them into a pretzel that you don't recognize. He says this, and that's a reflection of a genuine sense on the part of a lot of countries out there that this issue, the issue of peace between Israel and the Palestinians, continues to fester, is not getting resolved, and that nobody is willing to take the leap to bring it to closure. Jeffrey Goldberg was then interviewed on Bloomberg News about what do you think Barack Obama really meant, and this is what he had to say.
Talking about the demographics, very, very specific talk about, how Israel is going to cease to be a Jewish democracy at a certain point. Very, very specific talk about how he's having a harder time defending Israel in international organizations. I asked him very specifically, I said, are you increasingly unwilling or unable? I mean, there's obviously a difference. And he says, it's not willingness. He was careful to say that, the U.S.-Israel relationship is essentially undying, that the U.S. will always be there for Israel. We have policy differences, but the love remains. But he said, Israel's growing more isolated, and we can't defend it in the same way. And I took it to be a little bit of a veiled threat, to be honest. And I thought that was interesting.
You took it as a threat that from the United States, or what?
It's almost up there with nice little Jewish state you got there. I'd hate to see something happen to it. It was look, I want to help you, but you're not helping me help you, and therefore there's only so much political capital I'm going to go spend in the UN, with the EU, with the Arab League on your behalf. I mean, I think it was all couched very carefully, but it's there, and certainly the government in Israel feels like it's there.
And so Goldberg, in this interview, compared Obama to like a mafioso. Boy, you got a nice store there, and you need to do what I want you to do, pay me some money, or capitulate on the same reasons that I do, or something might happen to you. The United States support might not be there, Benjamin Netanyahu. I'd hate to see that happen, but these things, they're not really within my control. This is a man who has demonstrated over and over again that he does not care about the Jewish state or the Jewish character of the nation of Israel. He could care less about it. To him, it is a hindrance to a much larger agenda that he has to change and transform the world and culture. Now, I know that might sound like I think all I can say is examine the facts. He's not done anything. I reject any assertion that he is incompetent. He is doing exactly what he wants. He's thinking these things through, and you need to be aware of it. Now, his Secretary of State, John Kerry, there was a quote. It might be a little bit hard to hear this, but he went to a meeting of the Trilateral Commission, and a reporter was there and recorded what he had to say about Israel. And this is back the end of April.
The unitary state winds up either being an apartheid state with 75 citizens, or it winds up being a state that destroys the capacity of Israel to be into a state.
So he says this: a unitary state winds up either being an apartheid state with second-class citizens, or it ends up being a state that destroys the capacity of Israel to be a Jewish state. In other words, Israel is just like South Africa. They engage in apartheid. It is just a moronic statement. And then later in that same meeting, he said this: if there is a change of government or a change of heart, something will happen. So now our Secretary of State sees fit, with the blessing, I am sure, of his boss, to intervene in internal Israeli politics and get a person elected that they want. They would love to have Tzipi Livni, I think, as the Prime Minister of Israel. She heads the Justice Department. She negotiates with Abbas, and she's a problem. I mean, recently Netanyahu had to come out and say she doesn't speak for us. And that's a stunning change, Tzipi Livni. I mean, her parents were supporters of a greater Israel that would expand its borders even beyond where they are today. Well, what Kerry had to say, calling Israel an apartheid state, was subject to criticism. Official State Department spokesman, first name is Jen, I can't remember the last name, had this to say. And look, notice how she brings up Tzipi Livni in this. Secretary Kerry, like Justice Minister Livni and previous Israeli Prime Ministers Olmert and Barak, was reiterating why there's no such thing as a one-state solution if you believe, as he does, in the principle of a Jewish state. He was talking about the kind of future Israel wants and the kind of future both Israelis and Palestinians would want to envision. And so, with that in mind, the only thing then that John Kerry could think of was the word apartheid. He is a man without principle. Caroline Glick had this to say: anti-Semitism is not simple bigotry. It is a complex neurosis. It involves assigning malign intent to Jews where none exists on the one hand, and rejecting reason as a basis for understanding the world and operating within it on the other hand. John Kerry's recent use of the term apartheid in reference to Israel's future was an anti-Semitic act. She then goes on to talk about the fact that this myth that has grown up, and if you listen to the Boston University speech and other speeches of Kerry and Obama, they talk about the demographics don't work for Israel. If there was just one state and all the Palestinians came back, the Palestinians would be a majority and the Jews would lose out and we would have all this problem again. That's why we have to separate them. Caroline Glick has a great book out. I recommend you get it. The Israeli Solution, a one-state solution for peace in the Middle East. And also pray for Caroline's salvation. I would love to have her on our team. She said this: even if Kerry's fictional data were correct, the only apartheid state that has any chance of emerging is the Palestinian state that Kerry claims Israel's survival depends on. The Palestinians demand that the territory that would comprise their state must be ethnically cleansed of all Jewish presence before they will agree to accept sovereign responsibility for it. In other words, the future leaders of that state, from the PLO, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad alike, are so imbued with genocidal Jew hatred that they insist that all 650,000 Jews living in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria must be forcefully ejected from their homes. These Jewish towns, cities, and neighborhoods must all be emptied before the Palestinians would whose cause Kerry so widely champions, will even agree to set up their own apartheid state. I appreciate her boldness. And this is exactly what happened back in Europe at the time of World War I under the Nazis. They separated the Jews out, and we all know what happened there. There were 6 million Jews at least killed during that time, but that continued after World War II. You can see from this chart, looking at the number of Jews in 1948 and the number of Jews today. For example, let's go down here to Syria. 1948, 30,000 Jews lived in Syria. Today, about 100. This chart is a couple years old. I would suggest that it's probably close to zero. Iraq, 150,000 Jews in 1948, 35 at the time this chart was put together, which I think was 2 or 3 years ago. They went from almost close to 1 million down to 7,000 in the Arab world, the Arab countries around Israel. Somebody had a question?
Where are they? Where did they go?
They immigrated to other countries. Some to South America, some to Israel, and some to America. But the point of it is that these Arab Muslim states can't stand to have Jews, any Jews, living among them. You should get her book, The Israeli Solution. I'm going to play a clip of her being interviewed about that book on The Blaze.
It won't work because the Palestinians don't want 2 states. They want one state, an Arab state, and the obliteration of the Jewish state. It's been ever thus since 1920, and it will remain the case until, something completely fundamental transforms the Palestinian leadership. That hasn't happened. It doesn't look like it's happening soon. So this is just a recipe for continuous failure.
I feel like, because you get this, you kind of are a hater in the United States if you step up and you say, look, I think Israel is the one. I'm sure there are obviously lots of great Palestinians, and they all, everyone wants the best for their family, and I understand all of that. But it does seem like there are 2 really different sides in this conflict. And, you know, the Israelis seem to be the ones, at least to my impression, that are pushing for the sorts of values that we cherish here in America, and values that not only that we cherish, but also that are values that are protecting people's lives and individual freedoms. And on the other side of the debate, at least in the leadership, does not seem to be hitting those themes at all.
Well, I agree with you, and the reason that's true is because the Palestinian leadership are terrorists. They're senior PLO terrorists. The PLO itself is the architect of modern terrorism. I mean, they were the ones who started in airline hijackings. Mm-hmm. You know, these are the fulminators of everything that we're dealing with today, the originators of it. So, yeah, obviously there's a problem with them. And again, why do they conduct these things? Why do they continue to support terrorism? Because they see it as a strategic tool for eliminating Israel. They want to undermine the durability of Israeli society. They want to undermine Israel's alliance structure with the United States and with other Western democracies. And they're using constant grievance mongering about things that Israel never did, where they're projecting things that they've done to Jews upon their victims, Israel, and saying Israel's at fault, Israel's at fault. And that's really what's at the base of the two-state solution. It's a lie that claims that Israel is a guilty party for a conflict that it's been the primary victim of.
It's interesting because I think, and I see this mainly on the American left as a sort of foundational principle, which is sort of trying to project on people what we hope they are rather than what they actually are. We see this in Russia, certainly now, where we've tried to treat Russia as this ally, as this fair partner in all of these negotiations, and you see what happens with Ukraine and Georgia before that. And it seems like the same thing where we have former presidents, Jimmy Carter going over, he's meeting with Hamas.
Right.
You have Obama, who seems to treat the Palestinian leadership as if it's this fair partner that wants the same thing that Israel wants and that all Americans want. But that's naive, isn't it?
It's naive, but it's not just naive. It's very dangerous because the world is what it is. It's an imperfect place. It's a wonderful place, but it's also not perfect, and that's fine. The problem is that when you project concepts onto people that don't apply to them, then you're not actually letting them be themselves. You're not actually taking them for what they are. You're disrespecting them. So if somebody supports jihad, listen to him and deal with him appropriately. You can't wish it away. You have to cope with it. And so what I say in my book, The Israeli Solution, is the one thing that works truly is Israel. It's a liberal democracy that protects the rights of everybody. It's a deterrent force against all the rogues of the region because it's on the front lines. It has to defend itself. It doesn't have any choice. So that when Israel is strong, the cause of freedom is stronger. It's buffeted. When it's weakened, then the rogues gallery that wants to destroy Israel goes on the march. And so the idea behind the Israeli solution is, let us strengthen the only component of the Middle East that is doing good, and let us weaken those that are destabilizing it.
I know, quick programming note, I know we're running a little late, we had something else. Let's blow that off. Let's spend a little bit more time here with Caroline, because we need to get to this, because I think it's an important question, especially as we go towards the election. The question is, I think a lot of people will ask, is Israel, it's great that we're allies, that's fine, that's wonderful, but why is Israel so important to American interests?
Israel is important to America's interests because Israel shares America's interests. And so if you have an ally that isn't just a regime that, Hosni Mubarak was very supportive of Israel, but the Egyptian people were not supportive of America, but the Egyptian people didn't share that support. Mm-hmm. So if he's gone, then you don't have the same alliance with the successors that you had with him. Mm-hmm. In Israel, no matter who the government is, the people of Israel support the United States and share their values of human freedom and sanctity of life, first and foremost. And so you know that the stronger Israel is, the more secure those values are going to be. That's why it's important. When you're looking at the region, there's only one country there that shares and reflects America's values and its strategic interests, that no matter what it does to defend itself, by defending itself and by strengthening itself and protecting itself from people who want to destroy it, it's actually keeping at bay forces like Hamas, forces like Hezbollah, forces like Iran that also seek the destruction of the United States. That's why a strong Israel is so critical for America.
This has been such a tough region of the world for such a long time. And I think a lot of people would say, look, we're at a point where, maps don't even include Israel half the time. People won't even admit Jerusalem is the capital. So how, in pragmatic terms, how does something like this actually happen? With global leadership the way it is, how do we turn the tides as far as the debate has gone over this time and make this into a reality?
Well, I think that we have to talk about it. We have to have this discussion. The problem with the discourse that we've had on Israel and its neighbors really for the past 20 years is that it's been based upon false assumptions of Israeli culpability for the Arab rejection of Israel's right to exist. Israel's not responsible for people hating it any more than anybody is responsible for a bigot's hatred of it. Right? And so, we've had this discussion that has been, as I explained in my book, that has been completely removed from reality. And to change course, the first thing that we have to do is talk about reality. Let's talk about the truth. Let's have this conversation, because once you start doing that, then things begin to change very rapidly. It's just that, in Israel we've been having this conversation for a while now because we've seen, so many people murdered as a result of this lie of a two-state solution that we've moved past it. But the United States is still very much where the Israeli discourse was back in the mid-1990s. So the reason I wrote this book and directed it towards the American audience is because I just think it's well nigh time that the discussion that's been taking place in Israel now for 15 years should also must happen in the United States as well, because America is such an important country to Israel and to the world, and for Americans not to realize that there's an alternative to failure, for Americans not to realize why it is that Israel and the United States are allies, that's a problem. So I wrote this book with the hope that we can start a discussion. We're having it today, and I thank you and Glenn for that opportunity. And we just have to keep going, just keep talking.
But this rise of anti-Semitism, you see it especially on college campuses in the United States. Here's a young lady reported on Breitbart about a week ago. She no longer feels safe on the DePaul University campus in Chicago. In Chicago, a town with a Jewish mayor, UCLA campus, you have to do a pledge that you won't go to Israel if you're going to run for student government at UCLA. Now, folks, this may not be very popular in Columbus, but I have a question. And if I see a certain board member on the elevator, I'm going to ask him. I haven't seen him for a while, but he works in the same building that I do. The worst campus in America for anti-Semitic activity was UC Irvine in Irvine, California. I want to know if there was one trustee at Ohio State that asked the chancellor of that about that issue before he was hired as president of Ohio State University. Do you think that question ever came up? Now, if that happened at UC Irvine, do you think that it could happen at a campus locally? Absolutely. This is happening all over. This is a concerted effort. The Anti-Defamation League did a global anti-Semitism survey. They looked at these different anti-Semitism stereotypes, like Jews think they're better than other people, Jews have too much control over the United States government, too much control over the global media. And they came up with a test, and if you scored on 6 of 11, you believed those things to be true, probably true on their survey, then you would be considered in their scale anti-Semitic. Okay? So, percentage of respondents worldwide that they looked at, and they looked at thousands and thousands of people, percentage of respondents who say that at least 6 of the 11 negative stereotypes tested are probably true was 26% of the world's population at least in this survey, appears to be anti-Semitic. Look at some other results of this survey. That's 1.1 billion people in the world, at least according to this survey, are anti-Semitic. 35% of the people in the world have never heard of the Holocaust. 54% have. 33% have heard about the Holocaust and believe that it was accurately described by history. So in other words, even among the 54% that believe the Holocaust actually happened, 21% of those don't believe that it's accurately described. So 32% believe it's either a myth or has been greatly exaggerated. And the Middle East, MENA means Middle East, North Africa. That number goes up to 63%. Yes?
Who is the group of people surveyed here?
Countries, all, if you look at this map, the gray countries were not surveyed, okay? So they didn't survey Syria, the little thing called the war going on there. Central Asia, Afghanistan, some other countries. The yellow countries are the ones that were surveyed in this. So it was a worldwide, global survey. I mean, some of the myths they have, look at this, 48% think that the Jews make up more than 1% of the world's population. That would be 70 million people. It's really about a fifth of that worldwide. So that's the actual percentage of Jews' population. You can get the video and you can stop it and look at some of these things. But the Middle East is where the biggest problem is. For example, see in the lower left-hand corner here, these are the Middle East, North African countries. That's the Islamic crescent there along the Mediterranean and around the Mediterranean. It is probably true that Jews are responsible for most of the world's wars, and 65% in those countries agree with that statement is probably true. 63% believe that in the Middle East, North Africa, only 38% have heard of the Holocaust, and about 2/3 of those believe that it's been a myth or exaggeration. And here are the worst Semitic countries, anti-Semitic countries in the world. And you can see that virtually all of them are from the Muslim countries in the Middle East. In the top 16. You don't get to a non-Muslim country until you get to Greece at tied for 17th and 3rd. And then other Muslim countries. Those are the percentages of people in those countries that score as anti-Semitic on this survey. West Bank and Gaza, 93%. Iraq, 92%. Libya, 87%. So 74% of the Middle East overall was considered to be anti-Semitic. Middle East, North Africa. And you can see in the top 21 countries, there's only one non-Muslim country. Eastern Orthodox had a lot of anti-Semitism in it. Let's look at this. Let's take about 10 minutes to do this. The coming evangelical split. Now, last week, I talked about mysticism. I personally think, I hope that there's going to be a major split in the evangelical church over some of these issues. I would be very distressed if there was not a split. If people accepted rank Eastern mysticism, that their pastors are getting fed at these conferences like we talked about last week, I would hope that the faithful remnant of the church would rise up and say, okay, listen, if you want to do that, then we're out of here. We're going someplace else. We're going to fellowship with other believers. I think it's really reached the point where people have to make that decision. As I said last week, if your church is doing this, promoting it, your seminary is doing these spiritual formation type programs, then you're in, that incorporate this psychology, mysticism, will make everybody perfect, we don't really need God to help out, then you're in Babylon, and you need to leave Babylon. It's not good for Christians to live in Babylon. But there's a rise of anti-Christianity. There was a great editorial in the Christian Post back on May 17th by Wallace Henley, and he talks about this rise of anti-Christianity. We see it all over the place. The aim of grotesque caricature is to make the subject appear clownish, a bumbling buffoon who should not be taken seriously, or a sinister monster, as we will see in a moment. An interesting PhD dissertation topic relating to the history of cinema might be the shift in filmmaking from the usual depiction of the clergy and church and clergy as noble people out to serve others to the now cliche and formulaic, Bible-thumping, hypocritical fools who only want to exploit people. That which is caricatured to the public mind as unserious and irrelevant can easily be marginalized. Marginalization says the person, movement, institution, or ideas deserve only a minimal and peripheral role in the culture. But vilification suggests that there should really be no role at all for the vilified subject. It has nothing to contribute to the great societal conversation, not even from the cultural boondocks. Now the danger mounts and the possibility of persecution looms. I think this man has really hit the nail on the head. What has been merely caricatured, marginalized, or vilified is now villainized. That pesky person, movement, institution, or idea is no longer to be scorned merely, but feared. It's the bad boy on the cultural street, ready to trip or assault the noble civilization builders and freedom defenders who gallantly march by. They're marginalizing people who take a stand. The consensus makers in the contemporary establishments of entertainment, information, academia, and governance, and I would say and business, raise national awareness regarding these villains. At this point, there's not enough evidence to send an armed team to get the villains off the street, but the cultural SWAT team is standing by. Elimination logically flows from criminalization. The offenders must be removed for the greater good. In some parts of the world, elimination is of the blatant style. Hang them, gas them, behead them, anything, just eliminate them. In civilized America, elimination takes a different form. Fire corporate leaders who have gone against the political correctness in the establishment line. Dismiss them from boards. Lynch them in the media. Anything short of literal blood. Just get them out of the way. The church needs to be ready. She must also rest in the hope that, like the early church in Rome, she is prepared in the catacombs for greater ministry up in the public square. I think that guy really has a lot of good things to say in that article. But there is a lot of problems. I don't know if you noticed this decision. Remember where everybody stood in line for a long time to get Chick-fil-A sandwiches? You know, Chick-fil-A has now changed its position on gay marriage. They've apologized and moved on. They're not going to take that stand anymore. Thanks, though, for your help. The new head of Chick-fil-A said this: all of us becomes more wise as time goes by. I guess he's no longer a believer in the Flat Earth Society. We sincerely care about all people. And this is happening. We know this, the justices don't rule on this. And now there's a new book out that's going around evangelical circles called God and the Great Christian by this young man named Matthew Vines. There's a good response out by Al Mohler and other people from Southern Theological Seminary. You can find that online and download it. This young man is massively confused. He twists Scripture at his will to not only have it not condemn homosexuality, but to support it. They recently had a large conference call with a number of people about the book. Matthew Vines was there. I'm trying to remember the name of the magazine that had this. It was a website or magazine, emergent-oriented. Rachel Held Evans, she's a very big emergent writer. Jay Baker, son of Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, who's a big supporter of homosexuality in the church. And then Tony Jones, who raises the question in this thing, you can find it online, raises a question like, well, why are we even really not, this one's easy. Gay marriage and homosexual relationships and people living together. What about multiple sexual partners in relationships? Why shouldn't we be talking about that? That's how far he's gone. I'm going to play a clip
I hear from people all the time, from pastors who want to be open about being affirming, and they know that their entire church will fall apart once they do that, or they're convinced that their entire church will fall apart when they do that. And, so I'm in conversation with people who have a lot to lose, and it's not always that they're just worried about themselves. A lot of times they're worried about their church and their faith community, their family, and the repercussions of telling the truth about what they believe about this. But I try to encourage people to be, that maybe the people in their faith community are more ready for this conversation than they think they are, and that sometimes being in a position of leadership and taking that first step and saying, hey, I've been wrestling with this, I've been rethinking this, let's do this together as a community. It's a risk, and sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes churches fall apart, but sometimes it does work. Sometimes really fruitful, good conversations come of that. Everybody has to handle it differently, but I think sometimes we're not giving our friends and our family and our churches enough credit for being mature enough to be able to engage this conversation and entertain some new ideas and some new interpretations, or to look at the text in a different way. So, I could never say everybody has to come out before they're ready and share their position and share what they're working through. But I do think when people are in a position of leadership, whether that's online, whether that's in a church, has the opportunity to be brave and start some uncomfortable conversations, and that there are probably more people who will appreciate that than we're thinking. But it's not always out of selfishness that people wait. I know that from my own experience and from talking with other people. A lot of people are cautious because they're concerned about their church falling apart, or they're concerned about other people, not just themselves. So it's not always selfishness. Sometimes I think it's a real desire to keep the church unified. But we can't do that when people are suffering from an injustice. We have to, once you get there, I do think you have to say what you really think and speak the truth.
And it's interesting you bring up head coverings, Rachel, because you can go to conservative Bible church after conservative Bible church, and the women are not covering their heads, and then they're all going out for brunch and getting shrimp cocktail. Like, they are not taking the Bible literally uniformly. They put certain things in a bucket called contextually appropriate in the ancient world, no longer contextually appropriate, when they put on their polyester, dress to go to church. So it's just not that hard. The bigger questions, the questions that I think why conservatives push back and say, no, heterosexuality is normative, is based on more like some kind of big arc of sexuality across the biblical narrative, which is that heterosexuality is normative and homosexuality, when it's referred to, is abnormal. It's not normative. And that's true. And what I appreciate about Matthew is Matthew realizes that, understands that, doesn't shy away from that. Matthew's not trying to make Paul say something that Paul didn't say. Paul, even, the question is there a loophole here because Paul didn't know about long-standing, loving, monogamous, committed gay relationships? It's true. Paul did not know about that. Paul did not speak about that. That was an unknown arrangement in the ancient world. But to piggyback on something else Rachel said, that, again, I think it's probably beyond the scope of Matthew's book, is that we know today something that neither Jesus nor Paul knew, and that is that human sexuality is a lot more complex than people thought it was in the ancient world. We know that most people experience sexuality on a spectrum between hardcore hetero and hardcore homosexual kind of affinities. Most people are on a spectrum somewhere in the middle. There are bisexual people. There are people who experience their sexual identity, but it doesn't match their genitalia. And I realize these are all normative cases, but one thing that we can see in the ministry of Jesus was he was consumed with reaching the people who had been marginalized by the religious institutions of his day and bringing them back into the center of temple worship and Israel worship. So there's a lot, that Paul didn't experience. Paul never knew about driving cars, right? So you can go down the Amish road and say, well, since Paul never talked about driving a car, we cannot drive cars. But I think sexuality clearly falls into an area that we simply know a lot more about it now than they did in the ancient world. So contextualizing the 6 clobber verses, for me, it's one of the easier things to do biblically.
So he goes on to say, the question comes in, well, do you know more than Jesus? And I think this is the clip that plays is his response.
Paul did not have access to that kind of information and knowledge that we have. That's kind of what I'm saying.
Are you saying that? So are you saying that we know more than Jesus knew?
Yeah. For sure. I'm saying that Jesus did not know how to drive a car, and I know how to drive a car.
Listen, folks, I could keep you here for hours playing stuff like this. Now, later in his talk, he says, listen, and this is, mark this down, 12:03 on May 25th, I agree with Tony Jones.
I'm not particularly sanguine about churches being able to find a third way. I don't think it's possible. I don't see churches doing it. Here's what I think will happen. A lot of churches, I hope, will take Matthew's book and study it. They'll make it their study book. And as long as it's at that level, as long as it's a study group and the Wednesday night adult ed class is going to read it chapter by chapter and talk about it, everything will be fine. But as soon as the pastoral staff decides they're going to perform their first gay wedding, then people leave. Or they decide, in spite of Matthew's arguments, we're not going to do gay weddings, people leave. Like, it's when it comes to this is the crux of my article that'll go in the Christian Century. When it comes to the practices, that becomes the dividing line, right? So, I think that every time that I don't think you can probably change it from within. But I think that every time Matthew speaks publicly, every time someone watches his YouTube video, every time his book is read, like there's a chance that someone goes off the fence and into a camp that is affirming, that believes in a marriage equality, that wants the church to be more inclusive and graceful and accepting of people. Okay? So I'm 100% in favor of that, even if I'm a bit pessimistic about whether congregations at this point in history can actually make the shift. But people can make the shift. Individuals can make the shift. And Matthew's book is going to, and Matthew's YouTube video, which has been watched by nearly 1 million people, is going to cause people to leave their churches and go find more inclusive churches. And I don't think that's the worst thing. I think that it won't be long before within evangelicalism, voices like Jay's and Rachel's and Matthew's will be the majority, and voices like those Southern Baptist professors will be the minority. And less people will be listening to those voices. We're not there yet, but like Matthew's book gets us closer to the tipping point.
Okay, he says churches aren't ready for this. It's going to cause splits, and I hope that he's right. I fear that he may not be as accurate in his assessment. I fear that this stuff is going to sweep over the evangelical church just like mysticism is. But when you have people like Phileena Hurwitz going to Taylor University and Biola University in promoting this mysticism, let me show you how to worship God without words. When you're doing that, when you're in this altered state of consciousness, you are defenseless as to what's coming. You will not be able to stand up to it. And mark my words, this is coming, and it's coming in spades. So there is this book, God and the Gay Christian, a response to Matthew Vines. You can get it at Southern Theological Seminary website. Don't waste your money on that. Don't support this guy. Listen. This last week, what I had to say, and this week are crossroads for the church. Are churches going to put up with this or not? When I spoke in South Carolina, I talked about Ezekiel 23, but I concluded with Ezekiel 9. I want to conclude with that and then a passage from Philippians about what do we do? What do we do? So in Ezekiel chapter 9, remember this is right after Ezekiel's been taken on this vision. He's taken this journey from where he is in Babylon to Jerusalem, to the temple, and he walks through the temple, and they say, look at this, son of man, can you believe they're doing this? Look at what the elders are doing. Look at the leaders. Look at this guy and that guy. And they name the guys. Look at what they're doing in God's temple. There's women weeping for Tammuz. There's idolatry written on the walls of God's holy temple in Jerusalem that Solomon had built. Look at this, son of man. And then we see in Ezekiel 9 what the response is that God's going to do. Then he cried out in my hearing with a loud voice. This is the person talking to Ezekiel. Draw near, O executioners of the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand. Remember, it was bad in the northern kingdom. It was even worse in the southern kingdom. They had the temple, for crying out loud. Much like modern evangelicals will say, well, we have great seminaries. We have statements of faith that say we believe in the Bible. But the judgment on Judah was far worse than what had happened to the northern kingdom of Israel. Verse 2, behold, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate which faces north, each with his shattering weapon in his hand, and among them was a certain man clothed in linen with a writing case at his loins. They went in and they stood beside the bronze altar. Then the glory of the Lord, the glory of the God of Israel, went up from the cherub on which it had been to the threshold of the temple, and we learned that the Shekinah glory is on its way out. It's leaving this wretched, licentious, idolatrous people. It's leaving. And he called to the man clothed in linen, at whose loins was the writing case. The Lord said to him, go through the midst of the city, even through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over the abominations which are being committed in its midst. So, at the time, the letter used there is the Tav, and at the time of Ezekiel, that's what the letter looked like. Mark the people who sigh and groan. And so I would encourage you, are you someone who sees this stuff and sighs and groans at what you see? Then that's a good sign. If this bothers you. If it doesn't bother you, you have a problem. And your problem is you need the mark. You need the cross of Christ. In Philippians chapter 1, it kind of talks about what's going to happen. It's some principles that Paul gives. And he talks about this. Look, folks, I believe that the church is going to undergo persecution. It's happening all over the world. I have every reason to believe that it's going to happen here. I don't know what that looks like. You need to be prepared for it. But this is what Paul's attitude was to this, to that type of persecution. For me, to live as Christ and to die as gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which to choose. But I am hard-pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that your proud confidence in me may abound in Christ Jesus through my coming to you. Only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I will hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, in no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and that too from God. For to you it has been granted for Christ's sake not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake, experiencing the same conflict which you saw in me, and now here to be in me. Great passage for, I think, preparing our hearts and minds and attitudes for what may be coming in the days, weeks, and months and years ahead until the Lord returns. Let's pray. Father, thanks for your word, your Son, and the gift of salvation. Pray that you will help us to keep Paul's words in mind, that we will glory, we will act to your glory in the face of criticism and persecution. Bless us as we leave this week. In Jesus' name, amen.